inviting me. As Amanda mentioned, I'm originally from Missouri, and my wife and I have this running debate whether or not Missouri is in the South. And I'm here today, seeing there's no snow on the ground. I've got about 2 feet of snow in my backyard. I'm convinced I'm in the South. So. One more disclaimer. I am a sociologist, so it's a little bit out of my element here with law school. So hopefully it'll connect here. So I've studied rural communities now for over 30 years, and it would be easy to say a lot of the issues that I'll talk about are just kind of continuation of what we've seen happen in rural America over the last 75 years or so. But I do think, at least I'll try to make the argument today, that we may be at a tipping point, that there are some really unique trends that are emerging that we need to look at. And what I'll argue is that we need to kind of think about, first of all, new institutions that address some of these issues, and I'll elaborate on that. We need to think differently about how rural communities address economic development. And then third, I think we need to think more carefully about how we value nature in rural areas. And I think that will relate to my comments about sustainability. So, So quickly, I do want to spend a little time talking about what's happening in rural America and point to some of these kind of emerging trends that I think are really important for our discussion here today. Two, I'll talk a little bit about some of the obstacles we face that, and again, these are kind of persistent themes that we'll talk about, but I think they kind of raise some issues in terms of how we try to innovate and provide kind of new strategies in rural areas. And then I'll give you some examples of what are some innovative strategies that rural communities are adopting. But first, kind of one of the themes of this conference is sustainability. And a lot of people today talk about sustainability in the context of what they refer to as the triple bottom line. In other words, we need jobs, we need to protect the environment for the long term, but we also have to be concerned with issues of social equity and improving our employment and poverty. And it's a challenge. I mean, some of the strategies that we are looking at need to kind of focus on kind of how to resolve some of the conflicts. And I point this out. Let's see if my pointer will work here. What I've done in this, there we go. So that within each of these kind of dimensions, there are basic contradictions and conflicts we need to resolve in trying to promote sustainability. And obviously, one of the issues, is the conflict between environmental protection and social justice. That often, if we make it impossible for local people to make a living in the land, then that raises issues of economic opportunity and social justice. We have issues of conflict over here between economic growth and the environment, kind of traditional trade-off that people talk about between jobs and the environment. I'm not saying these can't be resolved. I'm just saying that there are issues that we need to think about when we look at new institutions and new approaches. And then on the bottom part here, we have basically a conflict between kind of the individual versus collective needs within communities and kind of how we resolve this. So the goal today is to try to kind of think about institutionally how we want to kind of promote policies and strategies that try to overcome some of these conflicts that we're facing. And don't get all caught up in some of the basic problems that we've been dealing with for the past couple of decades. So one more disclaimer. It's really difficult for me to think about a generalized discussion of rural America today because it's so different. The issues that we're facing in northern Wisconsin are really different than you might see in a southern rural community or a community in the Great Plains. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those differences, and I know your interest is more kind of with this region, but I think there's some insights that are to be gained from looking at some of these other areas as well. And obviously, I'll have to talk a lot about Wisconsin community, I'm sorry. But I know that. So I have an extension appointment, and I work with a lot of rural communities throughout the state that are kind of dealing with these types of issues. One more definitional issue. So a lot of my discussion here will really kind of focus on non-metropolitan areas. And just to give you a quick little census lesson, Metropolitan areas typically have a population of 50,000 or more, and they include the counties that are economically adjacent or dependent on them. So in Madison, for example, we have several counties surrounding our county that the vast majority or majority of people work within in Madison. So they are economically dependent upon the Madison metropolitan area. So you have a couple metro areas here in Kansas, and it leads over to Missouri, as you can see as well. So that's one of the things about kind of how we think about metro areas. So first kind of trend, this is kind of an old map, but it shows the farming dependent counties in rural America. And this is defined as having 15% or more of a county's income directly from farming during this period. And obviously the central message here is that most of the rural America is not dependent on farming today. And that, you still have the Great Plains that are highly dependent. But I think in my state we have 2 counties that are dependent upon farming, which is a bit surprising when I go out and talk to people about this. As you'll see in a minute, that there are other sources of income that are more important in many of these areas. I think this came to my mind when I was thinking about watching the farm debate recently. Someone mentioned over the Farm Bill, and someone on radio mentioned that there were only 35 congressional districts that were heavily dependent upon farming out of all. So it kind of raises some new issues about how we politically, how we're dealing with some of the changes in rural America, because it used to be that almost all the farmers had some interest in agriculture. And now it's kind of changed, and that changes the nature of the politics, I think, that we're dealing with in rural America. This is kind of the same type of thing in terms of manufacturing dependent, and this is counties that have 25% or more of their earnings from manufacturing. And you can see mostly the eastern rural areas. And I'll present some data in a minute. After the recession, many of these counties are the ones that got hammered by the Great Recession. So we've seen a lot of manufacturing plants closing, especially in the upper Midwest, but also in the Southeast, where they were heavily dependent on textile industries, low-wage employment, and those are the areas that were heavily hit by the Great Recession. Has really kind of changed the opportunities, I think, in many of these areas. And one other general map here. This is retirement destinations, and we don't have as many here in Kansas. This is a big issue here up in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, where I'm from, where this has been a major source of income for many of these communities. You can see that out of the Mountain West is a large area of destination for retirees. We've got the Ozarks area that's nearby here. Even Appalachia, there's kind of a growth in the retirement industry in that part of the country as well. That has slowed down as well, though. It's interesting, I think, with the recession. I think a lot of the retirees and movement out to rural areas has changed since the recession. And there's some questions whether or not it will return. All right, so quick little story about population change in rural America. As you can see, the gray graph there is total population change. And the general story is that it does cycle over time, right? So when I first started studying rural communities in the 70s, it was what they referred to as the rural renaissance. There was kind of rapid growth of people moving out. There was almost kind of a back to the land movement in the 70s, where people were moving back, small farms were growing, and there was kind of a sense of, well, this is really going to change the patterns that we're seeing. That all stopped with the recession in the 80s. You can see the rapid decline in population in the 80s. People didn't move back into rural areas. And then we moved back into the 90s, and there was kind of a growth again. And I think part of this was people moving out to rural areas, wanting to get out of the cities. We saw rapid growth in especially retirement, recreation areas. And that all came to a halt in the, obviously around 2000. It peaked a little bit again in the middle of the last decade. But the story here, the general trend is down. Obviously, it's part of the story. And we're now actually losing population in rural areas. One other thing about the graph that you should note here is that all of the population dynamics in rural areas is driven by migration. It's not births or deaths. It's all about people moving out into rural areas, and that's really what drives the population in most rural areas. I'll point to a couple issues here that's associated with this, is that one of the things that I do for a lot of rural areas in Wisconsin, we do population estimates for the school districts. And this is a really big issue because I think as many as about a third of the school districts in my state expect to vastly lose their school-age population in the next decade. So this raises all sorts of questions about the viability of these school districts in the long run. One school district a couple of years ago decided they were going to close the school district and send their kids to neighboring counties because they couldn't afford to maintain their school district. In other parts of the Great Plains, the issue is school consolidation, right? And big debates over losing their small schools and what this means. And this is going to be a bigger and bigger issue, I think, with the demographic changes that we're seeing in rural areas. So this is, I want to give you just a quick little historical view of this population loss. So you can see that through the 80s and 90s, the Great Plains pretty much maintain this constant pattern of losing population. A couple of other areas, Appalachia, the Delta area that are down on the Mississippi River, Mississippi, they were losing population over time. And, you know, for the most part, it's accelerated by younger adults moving out of rural areas, seeking jobs and better wages in more urban areas. Now, this is what the picture looked like before the recession. So during the 2000s, there was a wider area of regions that were losing population. The exceptions, again, were the Great Plains. Let's see if I can. So you've got the rapid population growth out in the Great Plains. You've got the Ozarks, again, was partially due to retirement, people moving into that area. And then you've got, obviously, East Coast, a lot of kind of urban-rural fringe population growing. And then you've got Florida that obviously was growing rapidly. But that changed after the recession. And this is kind of some of the more recent data. And what it shows is widespread loss in rural areas. That is, people are not migrating to rural areas, and more people are moving out. So we're in a net loss in almost all the areas. Areas in my state that had grown for decades, rural areas, and now are losing population once again. The exception, there are a couple exceptions. North Dakota, what's going on in North Dakota? You know, I think during the recession, I think they were the only state that balanced their budget, I think, because of all that energy development there. So the first lesson in all this is that we're seeing a real different pattern, I think, from the past. It's more widespread and general concern with the loss of population. So this is kind of the general story in terms of the rural areas. The cities are growing, and part of this is driven by, I think, a desire for more high-density development, environmental concerns. You know, cities are trying to curb sprawl. More people are moving to cities. There are other factors that I'll talk about. And the farther you get from cities, look at the non-adjacent rural areas, overall are losing population since the recession. Now you could argue that, well, maybe if economic times improve, that people will change. I think the survey data show that the residential preferences of people have changed a bit, that more and more people want to live in cities. Every year I ask my graduating seniors in my class, you know, where do you want to live? And, you know, what do you want to, you know, what size of town and all that. And it really is changed. I mean, most of the graduating seniors want to go to cities. They want to you know, cultural regions for economic opportunities. And it used to be more people would talk about, I want to live in a small town. I want kind of that rural lifestyle. And now, for some reason, some of these preferences have changed. It's another view of kind of, so the non-metro recreation counties are still growing a little bit. These are areas that are attractive for second homes and retirement and things like that. But the farming communities are losing population. Those that depend on manufacturing, especially, are still losing population as well. The exception, for much of the past decade has been those rural areas that are attractive to Hispanic migrants. And you can see the upper Midwest in particular, and western Kansas is another area where you have a lot of Hispanics moving into rural communities, often working in processing plants, low-skilled jobs, low-wage jobs. The effects for these rural communities is pretty substantial, especially for school districts. And I've seen some work in Minnesota, for example, where they found that they would have had to close a lot of school districts if it had not been for the Hispanic immigration in these rural areas. It's not without its challenges. We're seeing huge cultural differences emerge, issues of housing and social services. So it's really a difficult issue for especially LA small towns that have not historically been very diverse, but they are experiencing kind of this pretty radical cultural change, I think. Some states and some communities have actually reached out and tried to attract this. Iowa is one state in particular that has tried to attract more immigrants because they've been losing population for so long. It's been one of the governor's biggest strategies, that and trying to hold on to high school graduates who want to leave Iowa for other places. And one of the factors that contribute to this is the differential earnings between rural and urban. We'll talk a little bit about this. So you can see this dotted line is the differential between urban and rural wages. And the big story is today that the rural workers on average make around 70% of what urban workers make. Now there are some reasons for this. That is, partially it's due to the age of the rural population. It's due to the education of workers. That is, the rural workers tend to have less education. But it's also due to the brain drain, right? So the highly educated, the more younger workers leave the rural areas because of search for education, but also because their return on investment in education is higher in urban areas. In other words, if you get a technical degree, if you become a plumber, you're going to earn a lot more in an urban area than you will in a rural area. So that is a kind of a structural incentive for young, motivated workers to move out of rural Wisconsin and go to Minneapolis or Chicago. And the other part of the story, though, it is partially cultural. I mean, if you're 22 years old and you look at kind of the opportunities in many rural areas, I think they for a lot of cultural and social reasons, I think you can see this type of shift. So what we need to think about then is kind of how we kind of restructure our economy in a way to kind of hopefully hold on to more of those younger workers. Same way with poverty. Poverty tends to be a little bit higher. These data, the poverty rate seems to be rising more rapidly in rural areas right now, and we're seeing a lot more of other issues related to that. This just kind of breaks it down by race. You can see the high poverty rates among the blacks and Hispanics in the rural areas tends to be, again, much higher. And finally, this is my point about educational attainment. Kind of the story here is that rural workers generally have less education. They're more likely not to finish their high school degree. And for a lot of the jobs we're talking about in the newer economy, they require at least a technical college degree. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of strategies to address this. So let me just stop for a second. Enough of the data. So I had this running debate with a friend of mine who's an environmental historian, and his report to all my comments, he's heard me talk about this issue before, is, well, if you really love rural Wisconsin, you should live in the city, right? So just that all the sprawl and development is part of the environmental problems, and that the solution is just for everybody to move to the city, and kind of that'll solve the issue. And there's some concern, basically, of kind of, well, why should we care? Why should we care about rural development or rural communities at all? So a couple points I try to make to him, and I don't think I've convinced him yet, but one of my arguments basically is that rural people are the stewards of our natural resources, and that poverty can lead to a lot of problems with how we use those resources. And there's a substantial body of literature that says that poverty kind of forces people to look more short term with their resources, that it creates all sorts of problems. And so on that position, I think we need to be more concerned about how we use our resources and how the people on the land are affected. Long-term sustainability depends on protecting farmland to meet the needs of food and fuel. Clearly, we need to be concerned with how land use patterns are used and how people are on the land. And then finally, I think there's this kind of cyclical pattern here that as we lose younger workers, it diminishes economic opportunities in rural areas, businesses can't find workers, and that the whole kind of vicious cycle downward kind of makes things worse in the long run. So we need to stabilize this, I think, is the point in terms of addressing these issues. Now let me just quickly kind of summarize historically kind of what some of these obstacles are, and then I'll get into some of the more good news in terms of kind of how we approach this. But the first, I think that the general problem that we face in a lot of rural areas is that the low population density and size makes it very difficult to provide services such as healthcare, education, and all the things that rural communities need. And this is kind of a general, scale problem, right? Often, it results in thin labor markets. We have very few workers in various occupations, so it's hard to get enough people to train people to get into occupations, and as a result, rural areas generally attract a lot of very low-wage, low-skilled employers, and partially it's because they have a hard time attracting more skilled workers. Distance to markets can be a problem that we'll talk about, and finally, most rural communities tend to be heavily dependent upon a few industries, and this creates a lot of volatility and economic dependency. Right now in Wisconsin, we're dealing with a lot of paper manufacturers in northern Wisconsin that are closing, and they're moving out. This creates, if it's the only employer in town, typically providing good wages, it creates a lot of volatility and problems in those areas. So, what are some strategies for doing this? And again, my general argument is that we need to rethink how we approach rural development, and I'm going to focus on three just general areas. And the first that I'll elaborate on is regionalism, which simply means that we have a system where actually rural communities are competing for capital and people, and they seldom share services, they seldom coordinate with other communities surrounding them. And to deal with these problems of scale and size, I think we need to think more carefully about trying to find ways of facilitating coordination and collaboration across rural communities. This has all sorts of consequences, things like land use. I mean, one of the things is that in most states, land use decisions are pushed down to the very local level. People make decisions that affect their neighbors and has important consequences along those lines. So let me just start with regionalism first. I think that's what I'm going to start with. Yes, regionalism. And let me give you an example. So in southern Wisconsin, and throughout the state actually, the state is trying to promote more regional efforts at economic development. And this was an organization that was developed about, I guess about 7 or 8 years ago. And the idea here was to promote coordination across these 8 counties in southern Wisconsin. And the governor actually provided some incentives by providing resources for economic development if counties would collaborate and coordinate their economic development activities across the region. Now, at this point, it's still relatively limited. I mean, there is some sharing of services. I mean, one of the issues that they've taken up that I think has been effective. So one of the problems in this general area is that a lot of employers don't invest a lot in job training, and the low-skilled employers can't hold on to their workers very long. You know, some of these rural manufacturers had turnover rates of 100%. So everybody works in these manufacturing plants at one point in time. The high-skilled employers in Madison and some of the cities in this region couldn't find more trained skilled workers. And so one area that we started to work on in this region is what they call career ladders within the healthcare industry. And so the way this worked was that if you were a healthcare technician working for, you had very low skills, maybe not much education, if you stayed with your employer, they would invest job training that would allow you to move up into a more high-skilled type of healthcare occupation. The employers in this career ladder group that covered the whole region would agree to hire workers that had gone through this type of investment for these low-skilled workers. So it was solving problems for the low-skilled and the high-skilled employers in the region by kind of coordinating training. In the past, the training was kind of just the individual's responsibility. In other words, and it was causing a crisis within the healthcare industry because the employers were not doing any training. It took some coordination to kind of provide that type of incentive for the employers to come together and say, we've got some skill issues that we need to address if we're going to be able to survive here. And it has been pretty effective. I think the lower skilled workers stay longer with their employers because they have incentive. Because if they stay with them, they'll get more job training. The employers agree to provide, help them with their job training. On the other hand, the high-skilled employers are getting more skilled trained workers than they have in the past. And this is the type of regional coordination that this type of effort can make in trying to address these issues. Now, so the general issue that I think regionalism addresses is that most of our problems are not, that they don't match county boundaries or community boundaries perfectly, right? Most social, economic, environmental problems that we face have a spillover effect. And so we need to kind of think about how to solve things rather than just at the local level, how to try to coordinate things in a way to address these issues in rural communities. And this can occur at various levels. It could be just loose language of people sharing information about how to address issues or working with another. It could be cooperation on issues where there might be some marginal cost in working together and providing services. It could be, healthcare might be one, or social services or something like that. It might require some type of resources and shared goals. And it could eventually there be more collaboration where you have kind of even institutional approaches to this. The benefits are you have economies of scale, which is kind of one of the central problems that most rural communities face. How do we overcome the small scale and size in rural areas? It provides you access to resources, it helps capture spillover. I'm going to move on a little faster because I'm getting a little slower than I expected here, and a little bit more expertise and empowerment. Now, there's a couple issues I think that are pretty common to most of these regional approaches. They tend to focus on trying to coordinate land use, so instead of each municipality and each town or township making their own land use decisions, there's an effort to think about this on a regional scale. On a kind of a macro level, one of the best examples of this is Portland, Oregon, where they've established growth boundaries in their metropolitan area, and they don't extend services and infrastructure outside of this growth boundary. And it was really driven by the farming community that wanted to preserve farmland. So this type of strategy can be driven at a regional level where you're kind of coordinating land use, preserving farmland, but also trying to make the regional government more efficient. In some cases, it might even involve, this is pretty extreme, but it could involve tax sharing. One of the problems that we see across a lot of regions is that, for example, school systems are supported by local taxes. You have huge differences in kind of allocation for education. But employers throughout the region benefit from the investments in those workers. So are there strategies to share taxes and some services? You might look at affordable housing issues across the region, and even a lot of rural areas are trying to look at regional transportation systems. I mean, this is going to be a bigger issue of how you can get workers to jobs across the region, and a lot of them have failed. But I think a lot of rural areas are still thinking about trying to find rural regions. The obstacles, we still allocate resources based on population and employment for the most part. So it really sets up an incentive for each community to compete. right? And we have fragmented approaches, fragmented governments, and I think we need to think more about how we can encourage communities to collaborate by allocating resources differently, I think, to communities. It may require new institutions. On some regional levels, I know Minneapolis has a regional government where people actually are elected across a broader region, and that required kind of a new set of government. One of the difficulties I've seen across the country as they look at regional approaches is it is challenged by this sense of community, this sense of place. I used to teach in Georgia, and at that time, the city of Athens was merging with Clark County, which was the county it was located in, and there was a lot of resistance by local people who felt they were losing their connection to their community. I think this can be overcome. I mean, I think the problem in many rural communities is that sense of place is pretty strong, and it's often driven by high school athletics, right? How can we coordinate with our neighboring community because they're our chief competition, right? But I think the evidence is that over time these types of things can be overcome, and it is possible. Let me talk about a couple other approaches. So as you look, when we're looking at the data, obviously one of the areas that has continued to grow throughout much of the last couple of decades are those areas that are heavily dependent upon natural amenities. And increasingly, I think there's a sense that this could be a driver for the economy in many rural areas. I'll just give you a definition here. Very broadly, non-marketed qualities of a community to make it an attractive place to live and work. Couple important characteristics of this. It's hard to kind of produce this, so we're not going to produce the Rocky Mountains in Kansas, right? So we have to think about what are the natural amenities in these areas. When they're lost, it's often very difficult, maybe not possible, to reverse the effects. If you destroy the water quality in a lake, it makes it less attractive for people who want to live there. So, thinking about environmental quality along those lines. This is an economic term, but generally these natural amenities are highly income elastic. In other words, higher income people are more likely to be attracted to these natural amenities. So this has some, you look at some of these rural communities that are high amenity areas, they attract a lot of high income residents, and it creates some tensions between the natives and the new residents as they have different views about sustainability and what's important for those communities. And finally, you can't replace some of the natural qualities of these. So the central argument, I guess, behind this is that normally in rural areas we think about the environment as something you extract, natural resources, you export it, you create jobs, and that's kind of how we've driven economic development in most rural areas. But increasingly, I think these high amenity areas kind of are producing a different model, which emphasizes environmental quality as the real source of economic development. In other words, environmental quality attracts businesses, attracts people, and that the economy becomes based not on production and extraction of natural resources, but on conservation and consumption of that natural resource base. And increasingly, I think that the point is that there's more value attached to the second model of environmental quality, than the first. And what this means is this contradiction that I talked about often between jobs and environment may not really be as apparent in this model. In other words, protecting the environment is good for jobs, and it's good for producing long-term sustainability in these communities. The advantages of this, obviously we're valuing resources for long-term. I see this more, for example, up in northern Wisconsin, where the trees have usually been the source of extraction for the paper industry. But increasingly there are people who pay a lot to buy houses in rural northern Wisconsin because of that environment. And sustaining that environment becomes critical. Now it does create some real tensions that I think it is possible to kind of sustain both productive and consumption functions at the same time. You can still have an extractive industry, but it has to be very carefully protecting kind of that natural environment. And what we find in a lot of these high amenity areas is that this type of development then leads to more diversification of the economy, because it often depends on providing more services to those population, providing healthcare jobs, providing more social services and education. And the result is that the rural communities become less dependent on a single industry, but become more diverse and perhaps more sustainable in the long run. Obstacles, as I mentioned, what I've noticed is that often this creates a lot of social conflict. The newer residents typically want more emphasis on protecting the environment, more restrictive land use policies, while the older residents are all about providing more jobs for our kids, right? And less concerned with kind of some of the long-term effects there. One of the obstacles is that in a lot of areas, these types of jobs within these high-amenity areas are low-wage, part-time jobs. And this often means that in a lot of these high-amenity areas that it's very difficult for the workers to be able to afford to live in the communities where they work. And so you often have to deal with that issue. Free riding problem. The problem here is that in a lot of rural communities, this adds an additional burden on local governments to maintain the infrastructure. And the problem here is that the real users of this may not even live in the community. They may be urbanites who come and visit kind of a lake or whatever in rural Kansas. Maintaining that infrastructure, we need to think about who should pay, how we should pay for these types of services, because sometimes the real users are not the people who live in the community. And then finally, I can be concerned about it's a different term, gentrification of rural areas. As these high-income people move there, it may make it too pricey for a lot of the lower residents. I often use this term, the Aspen effect. If you're familiar with the Aspen area, where you have a real high-income area, low-income workers have to commute an hour or two to get to work because it's so expensive to live in that area. And I got a few minutes more. I want to talk about one more approach. A little background. I think historically, rural economic development has been based on trying to attract low-wage, low-skilled manufacturers to rural areas. This was the chief advantage rural areas have had for decades. What I think the time is right to begin to look at kind of strategies where we can try to kind of take more of a high road approach toward economic development, where we can add more value locally, where we can think about ways of trying to promote more high-skilled jobs. And one of the models that's used a lot across many rural areas are clusters. These are geographically collection of businesses and institutions that are linked by commonalities and complementarities. I'll give you one quick example. Over the last couple of decades, for some reason, there's been a growth in the number of plastic firms in rural Wisconsin, especially in the middle part of the state. I think it's because when the machine tool industry started declining, the workers in the area had a lot of skills that were attractive to the plastics industry. And so what we've seen is some very large and some very small firms emerging. And about 10 years ago, one of the larger firms, the owner was on the board at the University of Wisconsin, pulled together a lot of the industry together and said, we have some common needs and issues here. Let's try to work together to build around kind of the industrial cluster in plastics. And one of the things they did, again, going back to training, was that they developed kind of a three-tiered set of training programs where they started offering apprenticeship for high school kids in rural schools, where they could get some experience in the plastics industry. And that helped them on their entry level. And then if they went to work with the plastics industry, those firms came together and agreed to help provide funding for them to go to the technical college, where they could get a little bit more advanced education and training in the plastics industry. And they even went so far as if you stayed with them over a certain length of time, they would even send them off to UW South, where they could get a bachelor's degree in engineering that would help them kind of continue to move up within the plastics industry. This involved a lot of coordination, not only between the educational institutions, but also involved kind of connecting with suppliers. So the idea was, let's get connected with suppliers and have them work within the region rather than shipping them halfway across the country, which help kind of stabilize some of the rural areas as well. So that's kind of the general idea behind a cluster. Rather than viewing it as a single business or industry that's competing, let's collaborate and work together to try to find strategies to improve the pool. This simply just gives you kind of a model of what it looks like. And again, I think that this is the example in that 8-county region in Wisconsin that I mentioned. They focused on 3 different clusters they want to focus on. One is agricultural processing, so they bring together processors, but they also look at biotechnology. They've got firms, even in some of the smaller communities, that are building on biotechnology because of the location of the university, and then healthcare is the other kind of area that they focused on. What are some of the obstacles? Obviously, distance and all that makes it more difficult in a rural area to develop these clusters. Some of the best clusters, again, the examples that often used in the literature are Silicon Valley, right? Where you have high-tech firms that are working together, they exchange workers, collaborate. They're all highly concentrated. It's more difficult to accomplish, I think, in a rural area. Fragmentation of local governments, again, presents some obstacles to working together to solve some of these issues. And there's a bit of mistrust. I should say that when I started working with these plastics firms, because it was the largest firm that was kind of leading the effort, a lot of the smaller businesses just didn't trust this guy, right? They felt, well, he's just trying to get our workers. He's going to provide these training programs, and he'll offer higher wages and skim off all these our best workers. So there is kind of an issue, a collective action problem. They all need workers, but getting them to work together around these issues can be difficult. So I've got a few minutes left. Let me just kind of summarize some of the arguments here, and then I'll see if there are any questions. So I think one of the main points that I really didn't hammer home as much as I wanted to is that historically we have always thought of rural development as about agriculture and about farming. And increasingly I think we need to think more broadly about how we approach rural areas. It's obviously going to be a big part of the economy. It's going to be a driver, and many contention here is that we're stuck with a kind of a political system that relies heavily on fragmentation and competition among local governments. And this needs to be overcome if we're to be able to address the real issues that we're facing in rural America. Education, land use, environmental problems, all driven by this kind of fragmentation of local governments. And I think we have some models out there where communities can collaborate that I think is an important part of this as well. And finally, I think some of these models do offer some ideas about how to approach this idea of the triple bottom line. In other words, environmental quality need not be in conflict with jobs. And that there are models out there and ways we can protect the environment, we can continue to be productive and create jobs, and at the same time alleviate some of the problems with poverty and persistent poverty in many rural areas. But I don't think, I guess I'll leave you with the final word, I don't think it's going to happen without some rethinking about how we institutionalize and structure local government, and especially issues with land use and environmental protection. I think we need to think more broadly about some new ways to kind of approach these problems. So with that, I'll just stop and see if there are any questions. Comments?